They said he ate his enemies alive. Whether truth or rumor, one thing was certain. Under Domitian, Rome itself trembled as though it were the feast. Imagine the banquet halls of the emperor, marble floors, polished to mirror brightness. Torches burning against walls decorated with scenes of conquest, and gods watching from painted ceilings. Yet in the center of this magnificence sat a man whose eyes never rested. His gaze darted from senator to servant, from cupbearer to general, as though every face concealed betrayal. Domitian was not the Rome of Augustus, serene and glorious. He was not the laughter of Nero's games. He was suspicion made flesh. At his table, you did not know whether you were dining with an emperor or with your executioner. The night begins like a ritual. Silver platters laden with roasted boar, peacocks stuffed with spices, and amphorae of Falernian wine set before the guests. But no one dares to eat. They wait. For Domitian. For his signal. He dips his bread into the sauce and all hands follow. But the silence is louder than the music of lyres in the corner. Because every man present knows if the emperor suspects you, your last taste will be tonight's feast. He adored cruelty dressed as theater. Some accounts whisper of guests invited, only to be fed raw scraps of meat, their faces washed with perverse satisfaction. Others claimed he asked trembling prisoners to eat with him before they were dragged to execution. The tale of eating enemies alive may be exaggeration, but exaggerations thrive only in soil already poisoned by truth. And in Domitian's Rome, paranoia was the true meal. What made this fear so powerful was not just the act of killing, but the performance of uncertainty. A senator could toast the emperor with a golden goblet and find that same goblet refilled with poison. A general could be summoned for a reward, only to leave the palace wrapped in chains. He blurred the line between banquet and funeral, between life and death, until Rome itself staggered under the weight of constant dread. At the heart of Domitian's tyranny was control of perception. He painted himself as divine, calling himself Dominus et Deus, Lord and God. Statues of him rose across the empire. Yet beneath this godhood lay a trembling shadow. A man haunted by betrayal, by whispers of assassination, by the fate of emperors before him. He turned fear outward to mask the terror eating him alive. And so every banquet became theater, every guest an actor, every mouthful of food a gamble. The court learned to smile, to praise, to laugh on command, but their laughter was hollow, a brittle echo beneath the vaulted ceilings. Because somewhere between the torches and the shadows, they knew the emperor was listening, always listening, searching for one slip of the tongue that would end in blood. The empire itself mirrored its emperor's state. Senators bowed with forced reverence, soldiers obeyed with silent resentment, citizens whispered in taverns but never aloud in forums. Domitian's Rome was a palace of mirrors, where every word, every glance might bounce back with fatal consequence. And in that suffocating silence the story spread, that he ate his enemies alive, that he drank the fear of men as others drank wine. Was it true? Perhaps not in the flesh, but in the mind of Rome, the image was real enough to haunt. For sometimes the rumor of cruelty can feel more terrifying than cruelty itself. By day Domitian ruled with laws and decrees. By night he ruled with shadows. Fear became his greatest architecture, stronger than the Colosseum, higher than Rome's arches, more enduring than temples. He built it brick by brick, rumor by rumor, until it enclosed every senator, every soldier, every citizen. In the Senate, silence was law. Men who once debated freely now glanced at one another with lowered eyes. To speak too boldly was suicide. To speak too little, suspicion. Domitian's spies walked the marble floors like phantoms, listening, recording, twisting words into weapons. It was said that even the walls of the Curia had ears. And senators knew, one whisper of treason could see their names carved not in marble, but in the executioner's list. He staged his justice like a play. Accusations of conspiracy, often fabricated, were read aloud before frightened audiences. Senators condemned their peers to save themselves. Families watched husbands dragged away, property confiscated, reputations destroyed overnight. But the cruelty lay not only in death, it lay in the suspense. Domitian would keep his enemies waiting, lingering in prison cells, uncertain whether the knock on the door meant pardon or the sword. To the people of Rome, he was godlike, at least in appearance. He restored the economy, strengthened the frontiers, and entertained them with lavish games. Gladiators clashed beneath painted skies while Domitian presided from his gilded seat, his expression unreadable. But the arena itself became an extension of his paranoia. Criminals and slaves were sacrificed in grotesque displays, reminders that disobedience meant not just punishment, but public spectacle. Death in Domitian's Rome was always a performance, staged for maximum humiliation. There were darker whispers, stories of midnight banquets where prisoners were dressed in black, seated at candlelit tables, and served meals on dishes engraved with their own names. Domitian would watch them eat, laughing softly as though they dined at their own funerals. The torches cast long shadows across their faces, turning every blink into terror, every breath into a confession. When the feast ended, so did their lives. Whether these accounts were truth or rumor hardly mattered. They were believed, and belief was Domitian's sharpest weapon. Rome lived in the tension between horror and rumor, never certain where one ended and the other began. Fear doesn't need fact. It only needs imagination. Behind this tyranny was a man drowning in paranoia. Domitian's brother Titus had once ruled Rome with charisma and charm. Domitian had none of it. Where Titus inspired loyalty, Domitian demanded obedience. He feared betrayal from generals, senators, even his own blood. He slept little, pacing halls lined with guards. Convinced assassins waited in every shadow. He had mirrors installed across his palace, so no angle was left unwatched. Yet the more he watched Rome, the more Rome watched him. Suspicion was no longer his shield, it was his prison. For the emperor who wanted to be worshipped as a god, every smile concealed danger, every banquet threatened poison, every shadow held a blade. To survive in his Rome was not to live. It was to perform every hour of every day on the stage of his paranoia. And like all performances, there was only one possible ending. The audience would grow tired, and the actor would be left alone on the stage, consumed by the silence he himself had created. Rome under Domitian was no longer marble and triumph. It was a city built of whispers, its beauty lined with shadows. By the third decade of his reign, the emperor had transformed suspicion into an empire of its own. And in that empire, no one was safe. Not senators, not generals, not philosophers, not even family. Domitian's cruelty had evolved from punishments into performances of fear. He no longer simply executed traitors. He staged their ruin. Senators accused of conspiracy were dragged into the forum, stripped of their togas, and paraded like criminals before crowds who once bowed to them. Their estates were confiscated, their children reduced to beggars, their names erased from memory. In Rome, to be remembered was immortality. To be erased was a fate worse than death. Domitian wielded erasure as an art form. But cruelty alone was not enough. He demanded devotion that bordered on worship. He styled himself Dominus et Deus, Lord and God, and ordered that letters, decrees, even casual remarks refer to him as divine. Those who faltered, even by accident, were punished. A slip of the tongue could be fatal. Priests bent their rituals around his ego. Offerings to Jupiter quietly redirected to Domitian himself. The emperor who feared shadows demanded that Rome bow to his light. Paranoia consumed his nights. He slept in vast, echoing chambers with walls lined by guards. He paced at twilight, inspecting the polished marble for hidden daggers, the tapestries for listening ears. He forbade anyone to enter his presence armed, not even his closest advisors. He grew obsessed with omens, watching the flight of birds, the cracks in sacrificial livers, searching for signs of betrayal. Yet every omen confirmed the same truth. The dagger would come from within. His treatment of intellectuals revealed the depth of his fear. Philosophers who once debated freely in Rome's libraries were silenced. Domitian banned public teaching of philosophy, exiling Stoics, executing those who resisted. To him, philosophy was not wisdom, it was conspiracy disguised as thought. The empire that once celebrated the mind was forced into silence, its greatest voices snuffed out under the weight of a paranoid god. Yet the emperor's cruelty was not reserved for enemies alone. Even his family became prisoners of suspicion. His own cousin, Flavius Clemens, once heir to the throne, was accused of atheism, a charge historians whisper may have been Christianity or simply defiance. Clemens was executed. His wife, Domitilla, was banished. Rome watched in horror. If the emperor would kill his blood, who could escape his reach? Domitian's Rome became a city of staged horror. He built new arenas, new theaters, not for art, but for dominance. Exotic beasts from Africa, lions, panthers, even crocodiles, were unleashed on slaves and prisoners. These spectacles were not for entertainment alone. They were reminders. The emperor controlled not just Rome's laws, but its fear of blood and tooth. To watch a man torn apart by beasts was to watch Domitian's power incarnate. He delighted in psychological games. Guests invited to his midnight banquets entered rooms draped entirely in black. The ceiling, the walls, the couches, even the dishes were obsidian. Guests were seated under dim lamps shaped like funeral urns. Before them, food was served on plates engraved with their own names, as if they feasted at their own funerals. Domitian sat silent, smiling faintly, watching their hands tremble as they raised morsels to their lips. At dawn, most were released unharmed. But the terror lingered. To dine with Domitian was to dine with death itself, always uncertain if one would rise from the table alive. These rituals of fear rippled outward. Governors and provinces mirrored the emperor's cruelty, silencing dissent, exploiting terror as governance. Rome became a city of actors, every smile calculated, every gesture rehearsed, every word weighed for survival. Even slaves learned to watch their tone, to bow deeper, to carry their master's paranoia into every household. Domitian's madness infected Rome like a sickness, seeping into every brick and whisper. Yet amid the fear, the emperor's paranoia deepened. He trusted no one, not the Praetorian guards sworn to protect him, not the Senate cowed into silence, not even his own household staff. He walked hallways lined with mirrors, desperate to catch assassins at his back. He banned vine branches from his palace after a soothsayer predicted his death would come at the hands of a man named Stephanus, a prophecy that grew like a shadow over his every breath. His reign was a paradox, order on the outside, chaos within. Roads were paved, armies paid, aqueducts maintained. Rome prospered in infrastructure, but beneath the stone lay silence, and beneath silence, rage. Senators smiled through their terror. Soldiers saluted through clenched jaws. Rome bent, but did not break. For all his power, Domitian could not erase the simple truth. Fear unites as much as it divides, and every man forced to bow was a man secretly dreaming of revenge. Domitian believed himself eternal, a god walking in marble sandals. Yet gods live in temples of worship, not palaces of mirrors. His empire of suspicion was too fragile, too poison. And though no man dared speak it aloud, the thought spread silently through Rome's veins. The tyrant who devoured others would one day be devoured by his own fear. The emperor who silenced philosophy could not silence fate. And in the end, it was not beasts, nor armies, nor barbarians who would bring him down. It was whispers, the very whispers he had built his empire upon. Whispers that crept from chamber to chamber, soldier to senator, servant to slave. And soon those whispers would turn into footsteps. Footsteps carrying daggers. Footsteps echoing through marble halls. Footsteps that would end the reign of the god who was only ever a man. The end of a tyrant never begins with a sword. It begins with a whisper. By the final years of Domitian's reign, Rome itself was exhausted. Senators lived in fear, generals in chains of suspicion, philosophers in silence, families in mourning. The empire's marble facades gleamed as always, but underneath lay rot, a city suffocating in secrets. Domitian had built his throne upon paranoia, and paranoia is a blade that cuts both ways. He trusted no one. His meals were tasted by trembling slaves, his water sealed under guard, his rooms searched for poison. He forbade men to approach him armed, even his bodyguards. Yet in stripping away trust, he stripped away protection. The Praetorian Guard, Rome's fiercest defenders, had become his jailers. Some whispered that they had already chosen to look away when the end came. And then came the prophecy. A soothsayer had once told Domitian that his death would come at the hands of a man named Stephanus. It seemed laughable, until a freedman by that very name entered the palace. Stephanus was no soldier, no senator, but an administrator accused of embezzlement. He knew death awaited him, but in that doom he saw opportunity. He wrapped his arm in bandages, feigning injury, hiding a dagger beneath. And he waited. In those days, Domitian's fear was palpable. He paced at night, muttering omens, glancing over his shoulder. His once black hair was turning white at the edges. His once proud posture bent with sleeplessness. He no longer walked as a god, but as a man already haunted by his own ghost. The plot thickened within his own palace. Court officials, senators, even members of his household staff began conspiring. They were not motivated by justice, nor even morality. They were motivated by survival. To them, Domitian was a disease that could only be cured by death. One servant, Parthenius, head of the imperial chamberlains, opened the very doors meant to guard the emperor's life. Another, Maximus, aided Stephanus in his deception. Betrayal seeped into the emperor's walls like water into cracks. On the morning of September 18, 96 AD, the final act began. Domitian retired to his chamber, restless, uneasy. The palace was too quiet, the air too heavy. He summoned an astrologer, desperate for reassurance, but the stars gave no comfort. He paced the floor, his polished sandals clicking against marble, until Stephanus entered. The freedman bowed deeply, his bandaged arm cradled as if broken. He had come, he said, with urgent papers, evidence of a conspiracy. Domitian, forever hungry for the scent of treason, beckoned him closer. The room dimmed with the light of a single lamp. Shadows stretched long across the walls. And then, prophecy became flesh. From his bandages, Stephanus drew the dagger. He lunged, driving the blade toward the emperor's chest. Domitian reeled, stunned but not yet defeated. He grappled, seizing the freedman's hand, the dagger slipping, slicing across flesh. Blood spattered marble. The emperor shouted for aid, his voice echoing through corridors where guards had been told to stay away. No rescue came. The struggle was brutal, desperate. Stephanus, wounded, pressed forward, stabbing wildly. Domitian fought like a cornered beast, tearing at his attacker, his fingers gouging eyes, ripping cloth. But more conspirators rushed in. Parthenius, Maximus, others. Blades flashed. Domitian's cries turned to gurgles. One thrust pierced his thigh, another his chest. His blood pooled dark across the floor, staining the white marble. The god who demanded worship fell gasping, his wide eyes reflecting the ceiling he had once adorned with mirrors. No divine thunder, no Roman legions, no gods of Olympus came to save him. His last moments were not of glory, but of humiliation, slaughtered not on the battlefield, but in his own bedchamber, by servants and freedmen he thought beneath him. And then silence. When it was done, the conspirators stood trembling. Domitian's body lay twisted, his jeweled robe torn, his lifeblood seeping into the cracks of the palace stone. They had killed a god, or so he had called himself. But in death, he looked only like a man. Pale, broken, mortal. News spread quickly. In the Senate, men who once cowered rose in sudden relief. Domitian's statues were torn down, his name cursed. The Senate decreed damnatio memoriae, the condemnation of memory. His likeness was chiseled from stone, his name erased from inscriptions, his reign scrubbed from history. Rome itself tried to forget him, but memory cannot be destroyed by decree. The people of Rome whispered still of the midnight banquets, the black-clad funerals disguised as feasts, the executions, the paranoia. They whispered of a god-king who demanded worship but died like a thief in his own chambers. For all his power, Domitian left no heirs, no dynasty to bear his name. He was the last of the Flavians, and with his fall, his bloodline vanished into ash. Rome moved on, placing a gentler emperor, Nerva, upon the throne. But beneath the marble, the scars remained. Domitian's reign revealed a truth more haunting than any blade. A ruler who builds his empire on fear will one day be devoured by it. He ate his enemies alive, not with teeth, but with paranoia, suspicion, and cruelty. Yet in the end, it was his own paranoia that consumed him. And so the story ends as all tyrants' stories do. Not with triumph, not with eternity, but with whispers in the dark, a dagger in the shadows, and a forgotten name carved faintly into broken stone.